Welcome back to Ask the Educator, a podcast for all professionals involved in medical device processing and sponsored by Healthmark Industries. The education team here at Healthmark has 280 years of combined experience in areas ranging from sterile processing, endoscopy, OR, biomed, to hospital and industry leadership. Our goal is to leverage our collective experience to answer one of your questions each episode, giving you the practical tips you need to succeed in the evolving world of device processing. My name is Kevin Anderson, clinical educator here at Healthmark, and I will be your host. Let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back to Ask the Educator. I'm your host, Kevin Anderson, and with me today, joining me on this episode, I don't think that Damien needs much of an intro, as many in the industry will recognize him as past president of ISHM. However, for those of you who don't know, Damien not only serves as regional manager of sterile processing, but he has also served in the military. He's served on several AAMI working groups, as well as taking on the responsibility of co-chairing some of those groups. And more recently, he's been elected to the WFHSS Executive Committee. So congratulations on that, Damien. But I also wanted to say thank you for your service and congratulations on a full and accomplished career, but also just welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Kevin. It's, really an honor to be here, and I appreciate you and the team asking me to record and present this for your listeners. And yes, it's been an interesting career. I can say that I never thought when I joined the military at the ripe age of 17 that all these years later I'd be doing what I'm doing now. But it all ties in. It's created my experiences. It's created my foundation of where I like to work and where I like to lead from and where I like to interact. So some of the biggest honors, obviously, serving as ISHM's president for the 3 years that I did, and still serving ISHM, just not in that official capacity. More of a it's a joke going around ISHM with some of the current presidents and some of the past ones. They're actually calling me more of the ambassador now because I've extended my role beyond the borders of the United States, obviously, with what you said with the World Federation of Hospital Sterilization Sciences, which it was an honor to be elected amongst 68 countries to represent the world. But honestly, I'm the first American and the first ISHM member to receive this honor. So it's a 4-year commitment, but I'm looking forward to it. Unfortunately, it did entail with a lot of international travel, but nowadays it's a lot of Zoom and Skype and all that fun stuff. But we're all used to that. Hopefully next year they'll be meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, and I'll be able to go to that live in-person meeting. That'll be the first international travel underneath this new position. So I appreciate it. And Ask the Educators has been something I've watched for a long time and listened to. And I do appreciate what you guys do for our industry as well, too, and our profession.
Well, thank you, Damien. And it's an honor, obviously, to have you on here. And I'm very thankful for you to have that opportunity with WFHSS. And I think that's going to be awesome. And obviously, being the first American, that's a cool honor for you as well. But for this episode, I really wanted to introduce the audience to a new document coming out of AAMI, and it's a document known as TIR 12, which you are very instrumental in this document. So I thought, who better than to try and explain this than Damien? So why don't we get into it, and why don't you just give us a brief explanation of what a TIR is before we actually get into this specific document?
Absolutely. And it's a great question. It's probably one of the number one questions I get asked when we say TIR, because everybody's familiar with standards and ST 79 predominantly and ST 91 for the flexible endoscopes. But when you say TIR, people are like, well, is that a standard? What is that? It actually stands for Technical Information Report. And that's 12 is just a designator that AAMI assigns to standards or TIRs. There's a numerical sequence. So the next one would be 13 and so on and so forth. And not always. Sometimes they align with some ISO documents like this one does too. But this one's strictly around designing, testing, and labeling of medical devices intended for the processing by healthcare facilities. And this is a manufacturer's document. So there's different TIRs out there for different reasons. And recently, some of the listeners may know or heard of a TIR called TIR 34, which is water quality. It's great that what it's turning to now is actually standard now. It's actually in the development stage. So it's moving from a TIR to a standard. So if you kind of look at the hierarchy of AAMI, standards are kind of that high level of document that really, collaboration with industry, with end users, with regulatory, with surveyors. That's really what people use as the standards. TIRs are more of when it doesn't necessarily have enough information out there to become a standard. You maybe can't get consensus, or more importantly, and this is really what comes out, is the science and the data behind it. The evidence-based practice is not quite there strong enough to become a standard. So a TIR is kind of like a standard light, is like I like to call it. It is not something that regulatory people will necessarily enforce, or the FDA, but they play a part in it. And as the science, technology, and consensus amongst the members grows, so does that TIR. It could stay TIR forever, or it could actually turn into a standard like our water quality did. This one actually started because there's an international standard, an ISO standard, that covers the same exact thing. So ISO, for the International Standards Organizations, they have documents that AAMI tries to mirror. So this TIR started years ago with AAMI trying to mirror what the ISO document is. But the ISO document kind of changes and fluctuates because it's truly global. So that's the nice part. So this one's been around for a little while, and I was lucky enough that I was approached by a gentleman by the name of Ralph Basile. I think you've heard of him, Kevin, maybe once.
I might know him.
He actually served as co-chair on this. And the one thing about AAMI is they like to have diversity in their co-chairs. And when I say by diversity, the different type of professional modalities. So they don't want just all end users. They don't want all regulatory. They don't want all manufacturers. They want a good mixture. So they try to mix that up if they can. So knowing Ralph and working besides this great man for years, it was an honor for him to say, hey, I got an open co-chair position. We're looking for an end user. Would you be willing to? So how the process goes, I applied. It went to the members for a vote. I got voted in as co-chair. And a couple of years ago, that happened, and we just buttoned up this document. It is now approved. It is actually out there, and it is in use. So that's a very exciting thing to have another AAMI document release that's going to benefit the manufacturers as well as the end users, which I'm sure we're going to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you mentioned ISO, because helping people to understand the difference between ISO and AAMI, and why would AAMI try to maybe mimic or shadow what's going on in the ISO world? Is it because ISO is to a much broader audience? I mean, that's for all manufacturers, really, not just medical devices, correct?
Correct. And yes, that's a great way to put it. I mean, ISO really is, and again, this is where the end user side, this is where my learning came in a couple of years ago when I started to learn more about ISO. And I do sit on that ISO committee too. So I'm one of the United States experts to the ISO committee representing this document because it is a mirror document of an ISO standard. So it is global, but it is challenging for medical device manufacturing. Keep in mind, this TIR is for medical device manufacturers. But let's just say you're company X and you're making a product and you want to sell your product in Germany, you want to sell it in Asia, you want to sell in the United States. If you follow the ISO documents, yes, you then have that kind of global reach to sell your product for testing, designing, and labeling underneath that ISO. Well, we also in North America, we have the FDA and we have other stuff. So we wanted to make sure if you're going to try to sell a product meeting ISO standards, it at least aligns with the AAMI standards, which the FDA also sits on and participates in. So it benefits the manufacturers to sell in the United States, but also around the globe.
Excellent. That definitely helps clear that up for me. And regarding TIR 12, you've mentioned this has to do with labeling and all of that. So in that it's going to be geared towards the manufacturers of products. I guess my question is what should our audience who, generally there's going to be a lot of end users out there. How will this impact them at the end user level, in the facilities processing devices every day? How's this going to impact them?
Yeah, and that's the part that sometimes is challenging working with AAMI groups because you have to put on different hats when you're sitting in a group. So a couple of years ago, I co-chaired a container document, and it was, again, similar to this. It was how do you design and label containers, rigid containers for use in healthcare facilities. Well, my sterile processing brain kicked in and went, oh, we need to tell them this and this and this and this. And then realizing, wait a second, this is telling the manufacturers how to do it the right way so you can actually clear it. And I'll get into that in a little while. But also, how do you write instructions for the end user to follow? What is the end user? So as they were designing this document, most of it is related to the actual scientific validation testing for medical devices. And when we say medical devices, we're saying all medical devices, not just instruments. I mean, so it's kind of got a broad scope when you talk about that. I mean, medical device could be a bed. It could be a MRI machine. I mean, those things fall under this purview as well, too. So you got to kind of look at that, because those beds need to be cleaned as well. And they need instructions for use on how to clean them, no different than instructions for use how to clean a robot arm. So what we do as end users participate in this is when we hear manufacturers saying, well, we're going to test this to validate this, then to write in instructions, I kind of go, well, okay, that's a great testing, that's a great validating, but that is not something I have in my hospital, nor will I ever have. So your testing and validating will give you instructions that I may or may not be able to follow. So providing the manufacturers that valuable feedback during this document will help the end user at the end, because then we'll get documents. We've all read those IFUs that you're like, what is this? Who wrote this? Well, it is a true validated IFU, but it's validated under non-hospital settings, a non-end user setting. So I wanted to make sure the end users are representatives to go, that makes sense, I can follow that. I don't want to ever tell a manufacturer, restrict their trade, restrict their thing, but I want to make sure that whatever they're designing and however they're testing it and however they're telling us how to disassemble, clean, and sterilize actually can happen. Because as we know, that's been kind of the challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I love that you brought up the challenges within the IFU and everything. And I know that just briefly looking over the TIR, I didn't really have enough time to read the entire thing thoroughly, but I noticed that there's some guidance there on how they should explain the cleaning, about maybe even disinfecting and the different levels of disinfecting. And then, so the scope of this project, this TIR, is helping get those manufacturers into thinking about how they're going to communicate the processing of these devices back to us, the end users. And I think that's great, because I think, just like you said, unfortunately, we've all been able to, or had the unfortunate experience where we open up an IFU and we can't find what it is we're looking for, whether it's the cleaning part or the inspection part or even the labeling part. Whatever it is, we're having a hard time finding what we need. One thing you brought up earlier is about containers. That is a separate TIR. Is that what you said?
So that's actually a standard.
That's actually a standard. Okay. And which one is that?
Oh, you would give me ST77.
77. Okay. So between container standard, now you have this one, we're starting to get a big picture and we're starting to address all these various issues, right?
No, and that's the fun part about it. And that's what excites me about sterile processing and reprocessing in general, is no day is alike. I mean, some of the tasks we do can be the same every day, but that's any job you have. That's life. But we're challenged every day with the changing technology, old standards, new standards, old IFUs, new IFUs. And you don't look at it as a negative thing. You look at it as that opportunity. You go, how can I understand more? And more importantly, in my case, how can I help? And how can I help my industry, my profession? I've been very fortunate to be able to do that. And for some reason, this speaks well to my brain. I can translate standards language, and it's not always easy. So I've been with the AAMI standards groups for 15 plus years, and I've seen end users come and go because they just go, oh my God, this makes no sense to me. And that's not bad on them. It's just, it is a different language. We're actually trying to clean it up so it makes a little more sense, so manufacturers understand it. So what I want to point out, Kevin, is this document really, it's been around for a while, long time, but it didn't focus as much on the cleaning. This is where we really lacked. And I think this is where we focused a lot as a work group on, is to make sure we put more meat around cleaning of medical devices, because we all know how important that is. And we really spent time with the manufacturers. So when they're designing a device, look at these considerations. What's the material? What's material compatibility? What's the disassembly? Can a brush fit in there? All that stuff. Then the next one is validating and testing processes. So whatever they test, is it valid? I mean, does it actually work? There's a risk analysis involved. So if something conflicts, what do you do? But really what they focus on, and this is what was new in this document, is they looked at liquid chemical disinfectants commonly used in healthcare facilities. Well, again, now we're saying what's used in healthcare facilities versus liquid chemical disinfectants, because there's a lot of them on the market, but we don't have access to them. So if you're going to make an IFU wanting liquid chemical disinfectant, they can now refer to, oh, this is what they use. Oh, okay, I get it. Then I can design something to it. Then I can validate my testing to it. They also looked at sterilization cycles commonly available in healthcare facilities. Teeing you up here, Kevin. I hope you feel it coming. But the sterilization is very interesting because think about this, and we've all experienced this. We've had some crazy IFUs with some crazy extended cycles. And 25 minutes, 30 minutes sterilization trial, pre-vac. And I'm like, where did this come from? Well, because there was no guidance for the manufacturer. So they went to Joe's testing lab and they said, hey, I got a product here, kind of validate the sterilization. So sure, they designed it. They did a testing procedure on a 30-minute, and guess what? It passed. Everything they did passed that cycle. And FDA says, prove it. So they can prove it with documentation and testing material. FDA says, okay, you got a clearance. And now that's printed in their IFU. But then when it hits us, that's not a cycle we run. We don't have products. We don't have containers. We don't have BIs. We don't have CIs that meet that 30-minute or that crazy cycle that's out there. So we gave the manufacturer, like, here's the common cycles that we use. So if you're going to validate something, please use this cycle of sterilization. Please use this chemical disinfectant, and so on and so forth.
Wow, Damien, I think you're going to generate some fans on that one because all of us can relate to that. I remember getting a device and it was, a brand new instrument, just a regular kerosene instrument, everyday thing that I was shocked to see that even that one was specified to go in for 5 minutes instead of 4. And I'm like, well, now I have to change the cycle just for that one instrument. Not that it's a huge deal. It's not going from 4 to 30 like you mentioned, but we've all experienced all these different IFUs and how they have all these various specifications. I know that some of them only have gravity, and it's like, wow, I'm going to use this entire sterilizer for one item that has to be gravity. Like all of those things come into play. And I'll tell you what, if everything could just be standardized into that, 4-minute 30, I think we'd all be really happy with that. I don't know if that will happen overnight, but a standard like this sounds like it will address some of those things and help us get there.
Yeah, and great point. And that's exactly it. So keep in mind, to the listeners out there, this doesn't mean that now this document's out that you have a product that was designed, tested, and FDA cleared 10 years ago, that it's got some weird cycle on it or some weird disinfectant that we don't use. I mean, I've seen IFUs that say use Dawn dish soap. I'm not kidding you. It's out there. But it doesn't mean that they have to go back and change those. So FDA doesn't reach backwards unless there's an actually patient harm type of a scenario. So right. This is going forward. Any new products that are being designed, this is what manufacturers are encouraged to follow. And the FDA is actually on board with this. They participated pretty heavily in this. But if you get a crazy cycle, and I'll call out, I don't know if I'll call it a product. I won't do that. But there was a product and one device. It is a positioning device. I'll leave it there. That had a crazy cycle again, too. And I'm like, this makes no sense. It is a very simple positioning device. Why does it have this crazy cycle? I reach out to the company. They said, well, that's just what our testing lab gave us. And the FDA approved it. And I said, okay, I would like to buy your product, but I'm going to tell my doctor not to buy it because you don't follow the TIR that's currently out there and you don't have hospital cycles and all that stuff. So they looked into it. And sure enough, they revalidated the product underneath these conditions. And now it's a 4-minute cycle. And it makes sense. And it passed perfectly fine. Now, that's a company that's very willing to work with the end user. And not all companies are, but most of them are. They really want to do the right thing. But revalidation also costs a lot of money. So you got to understand the risk-benefit ratio for the companies too. But hopefully, as they get a lot of feedback from end users, positive feedback and constructive feedback, manufacturers of devices will refer to this and go, oh, okay, I see why the industry's pushing back, because these aren't common cycles to a healthcare facility, and it's really messing them up. And then maybe we should reconsider. They're not going to do it just because Damien asked. They're going to do it if 500 different Damiens ask, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, and I think that was a great point for listeners too. When you have a question or when you have a point of contention with an IFU, instead of just like glossing over it, I know it's a little bit extra work, but contacting the manufacturer is such a great idea because oftentimes they don't know the issues or they don't know what we're dealing with, which is also a great reason for this, this document to come into play and to share that with them. But another thing that I thought is interesting about this is, and you briefly touched on it, was the cleaning side and how there's more specifics around cleaning, but even point of use as well. I mean, these are foundational components to reusable medical devices. So I'm glad that that's in there. What are your kind of highlight takeaways from that component, the cleaning and point of use parts.
So absolutely. The point of use is we spent a lot of time on it, and it was a little confusing, I'll see, even on my end, just because the scope of this document covers everything. We can't just talk about medical instruments, for instance. So if you say you need to do some point of use cleaning and remove it from the area can do further stuff, whatever that might be. Well, this also includes an MRI machine. So are you going to say you're going to remove the MRI machine from the patient's room? Or so we had to write it so that it was inclusive of anything that could touch a patient or patient touches that needed point of use cleaning. And I think we hit it pretty good. I mean, we had people from Philips, we had people from Siemens, we had Medtronic. I mean, you name it. We had multiple manufacturers there that represent different products that need to be pre-cleaned, that need to be disinfected for the next use, not necessarily sterilized, but low or intermediate disinfected. Well, all that plays in there, the environmental service disinfection. So we spent a lot of time on that. But the most important one, this is one I love to share with people. It's near and dear to my heart because I worked on it pretty hard but I can't take credit for it. There was a lot smarter people than I do in this. But they crosswalked, I want to say 230 to 250 different IFUs in the cleaning process and said, okay, you got and I'm just going to be very simple-minded here. You got a knife handle. A knife handle requires soaking, brushing, and it can go into the machine wash if you have it, or contact time and hand wash. You have a needle driver. You have a Zimmer total and hip tray. You have a robot arm. What are the commonalities between the 230, 250 IFUs that this task force looked at and says, can we create classifications, cleaning classifications for the different instruments so the end users then can say, I've got a class 1 device and it requires these things. I got a class 2 device, it requires these things. I got a class 3 device, it requires these things. So we're trying to bucket devices into different classifications so that they will understand the type of cleaning processes. A good example is if you have a Ranger set or a Kerrison set, those might all be class 2 devices. So then I need a sonication is now added to class 2. I'll use as an example. So it's a soak, it's a brush, it's a flush, it's a sonic, then it can go through machine wash. Then if I have something else, it may require something a little bit more different. So we created these classifications for the manufacturers to write in their IFUs so that we can train our staff and say, and even think about it, instrument tracking software can say this tray or this instrument is class 1 cleaning, and these are the steps you do for class 1. This one is class 3, so you got to do these steps, all the way to a robot arm, for instance, pretty complex device on how to clean. So bucketing them into these commonalities of their approved IFUs is a long way. Now, it's in the document. It's informative, so that means it's not a requirement. It's information. But manufacturers were very happy to do that. And I could see some end users and some industry grabbing onto this pretty quickly and expanding it. And that's what we really wanted to get done. That's probably, to me, one of the bigger successes of this document.
Awesome. I was hoping you would share some of your favorite parts, and I can understand why that would be on the top of the list there, because I know that there's a lot of managers out there that have really tried to do that with devices on a manual sort of level with their own inventories. And it's a painstaking process to do that. One that is smart, though. Put all these different devices into different buckets, and then you have an easier way to categorize them, an easier way to understand what the process is going to look like for them when it comes to the cleaning and decontamination of those instruments. So I think that's fantastic and a great highlight to bring up. And unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I did want to allow you, if you had any last thoughts or any last highlights you wanted to share.
Again, there's so many good parts, but that one I think can actually, to our previous conversation, what are the end users going to get out of this document that's for manufacturers? I think that's the big takeaway. No, again, I appreciate you and your listeners, Kevin. I tell you, it's been a journey. A lot of people ask me, how do I get to where you've done and what you do? And I just say, just keep doing it. I absolutely love what I do. I have 3 hospitals that I oversee operationally, so I'm very busy with all that, but I take care of my teams. I'm sitting here in my office in Colorado doing a podcast, and my department's out there working hard, and my other 2 hospitals are working hard, and my phone hasn't rang once, my door hasn't knocked once. And it's not because they don't know I'm here. They know I'm here, but they do such a great job. So I empower my staff, and I give them the tools, the training, and the resources to do their job at the end of the day. My big job is remove barriers from them. If I can remove barriers from them doing their job and providing the tools, providing the training, then I can be free to do some of these other things like go to the AAMI meetings and do podcasts to educate people. It's just an honor for me to do that. So I encourage people to stretch out of your comfort zone. I encourage people to try something new, ask the questions. I've annoyed a lot of people in my career by asking a lot of questions. I just like to ask why, but I listen too. There's the other difference. Don't just ask a question just to ask a question. Ask a question to seek understanding, and then do something with it. I mean, and then make it happen. And that's the secret to success, at least for me. I'm blessed to call this my profession and be associated with so many great people around the country and around the globe, and just like you and some other ones. So I appreciate everything you do for our profession, and we'll just keep continuing doing the good stuff we do, taking care of our patients.
That's right, Damien. Thanks so much for being on the show and for the advice too. I think everybody can benefit from, listening to some words of advice from people who've blazed some trails and did some different things. And I think we'd all do well to listen to each other, whether you're newer or have been around the industry for a long time. I think we all have something to offer. So I appreciate your words there to our audience and for coming on the show and being a guest.
You're welcome. And I tell everybody, I'm out there on social media. If anybody's got questions for me, I try to get back to everybody who's got a question for me. I really, really do. So feel free to contact me, reach out to me. I'm here for everybody.
All right, that wraps up our interview with Damien Berg. He shared with us some of the main highlights of the AAMI document TIR 12, which is a technical information report all about designing, testing, and labeling medical devices. And this report is directed specifically to medical device manufacturers, so if you are on the manufacturing side, please pay attention to this report because it will help guide you in producing a more user-friendly device. Now, if you're on the end user side, just know that there is hopefully going to be more uniformity to IFUs of devices coming to you in the future. And whether you're on the manufacturing side of things or the end user side, we encourage you to get involved with AAMI so that your voice can be heard and so you are better prepared for changes in the industry. If you have any questions for us, please send them to our email address at asktheeducator@hmark.com. Thank you all for listening. All opinions expressed on this show are those of the presenters. Before using any medical device, it is important to review the device manufacturer's instructions for use.